So the next of the videos that we're covering at this stage in the Eye to Eye project, in terms of a basic introduction to service design and to service design techniques that can help us as we begin the process of conducting our neighbourhood analysis, is interviews. And again, interviews will be nothing new to those of you who either have service design experience yourselves already or are used to working in a qualitative research tradition, or even working in the public sector environment. There's certainly a lot of activity that would fall into the category of an interview that we would use as part of normal development work in terms of speaking to our colleagues, speaking to service managers, and speaking to service users if we're focused on taking a user-centered approach to service development. But what hopefully we'll cover in this video is basically just some little hints and tips and a little bit of background, with the presumption, of course, that this would work or this would help someone with no prior experience, but I'm well aware that that probably isn't very many of you. So hopefully, again, this can provide the basis of a starting point for further discussion, and in particular further discussion about how best to employ interviews as a research technique for understanding more about the issues of social isolation and loneliness in particular. So, as you will doubtless be aware, interviews are a powerful technique for understanding more in a deep way about how people think, and being able to take the time with them to understand their motivations or probe a little bit deeper into their behavior or their rationalization of their behavior as to why they do things in a certain way. And this contrasts, as I discussed in the observation video, with observation as a technique, which is more about watching what people do, potentially to almost juxtapose that, to contrast that with what they say they'll do, or they do, because often there's a bit of a difference between those two things. We discussed in the observation video about how interviews can often go hand in hand with observation, either the nature of questioning people as you're conducting an observation can often verge on an interview, or the idea that we might follow up immediately after conducting an observation of somebody in their workplace or in a particular context with a more detailed interview, to help us understand what it is we've actually seen them do. So these two techniques often go hand in hand. I did clarify in the observation video, however, that observation is distinct for the fact that you are predominantly watching, with the emphasis on being a passive observer. You can often ask questions, but that those questions should not be getting in the way of people being able to show you what it is that they're doing or giving you a guided tour of a neighbourhood. That's the purpose of observation. Interviews, therefore, are the opposite of that. They are away from a particular context. They are usually in a fairly nondescript location, an office, or perhaps at a cafe, and very much taking people out of the context that they're normally in or that you would normally be observing them in, and then giving them a chance to sit and reflect in response to your questions on some of the deeper justifications or motivations that they have. So interviews can take a number of forms. They can be very unstructured, where you have a sort of loose starting point for a more informal conversation, typically an unstructured conversation, or you can have a very structured list of questions that you've prepared in advance that you sort of want to get through to enable you to compare the participants' responses with other participants, or be able to grade their responses in a more analytical way. Or, as is more often the case, I think, with sort of professional service design activity, you can adopt a semi-structured approach, which is sort of somewhere in the middle of those two things, where you perhaps have a rough framework of the sorts of information you want to gather from people, or the sorts of questions you want answers to, but that you're leaving space in how you ask those questions and how you conduct that interview for people to elaborate and take the conversation away from the questions, perhaps in the direction that they want to take it, to give them a chance to discuss the things that they want to say, whilst keeping it within reasonably clear parameters. So obviously, depending on how you're planning to approach the problem and depending perhaps on who the person is that you're interviewing, you may need to provide them with more structure as well. It might be that this is the first time they've really reflected on this aspect of social isolation and loneliness, or the first time they've ever had somebody question them on their work behavior or their attitude towards certain things. So sometimes having a structured approach can be good, just to make sure that people feel like the parameters are clear in terms of what they're being asked about. And it can also be good if you're relatively new yourself at conducting interviews, to at least have a fairly clearly defined structure as your starting point. Obviously, if you've determined that it doesn't matter if you stray from that structure, then you don't have to use the structure, but at least you have one there to help you. And we'll come on in this video and discuss a few of the ways that you can create that structure, as well as what sort of structure might be most appropriate in terms of this particular neighbourhood analysis and in terms of this particular problem around social isolation and loneliness. So that takes us also to the next stage in thinking about the interview process, which is identifying the role that you yourself are going to play, and if there are going to be other people with you to help you with the interview process. Now, I would certainly encourage there to be, if it's possible, at least two of you present in the interview, and that's largely because it can help with having one person who's asking the questions and another who's taking notes. Being able to do both at the same time is very difficult. And obviously, given the times that we're living in at the moment and the fact that many of these interviews might have to be conducted by Skype or video conference, that it may be possible that you can get away with one person being the interviewer, and then record the interview so that you can play it back later and get able to take notes on a second pass. It's also possible, of course, that even when you're conducting interviews in person, that you record the interview, and I would encourage you to do that. Obviously, the process of transcribing the interviews can become quite time consuming, but having a recording that you can go back to later in the project or as you're beginning to analyze or build on the reflections can be very valuable. But it can also be very valuable, as I say, to have another person with you so that you can triangulate the perspectives, so that you can discuss with the other participants after the interview what it was you've actually heard and whether you all have the same picture of what was said. So obviously, if you are going to have multiple people in the interview, it's very important that you have a shared picture around how that interview is going to be conducted and what the different roles are that you have. And I mention these now. We'll also obviously come on to talk about what you're actually going to be asking in the interview. But I think these sort of principles are actually pretty good to think about, even if there's only one of you in the interview, about what tone you want to set and how you're going to ask the questions and how you want to come across to the person being interviewed. We talked a little in the observation videos around the role that you can play and the different impact that can have on how the interview feels for the participant or how the observation feels for the person being observed, depending on how you build that rapport and the sort of tone that you set with how you ask the questions, or if there's multiple people there, how each of you play your role in the interview process, whether you're alternating questions or whether it's simply one of you who's conducting the activity of asking the questions and another who's taking notes. It's really a good idea to sort of think about this quite early in the interview planning process, depending, of course, on how much resource you have available to help you with the interviews, and also a lot dependent on who the person is who you're interviewing. Are they someone who's very experienced, who's used to talking about their work, who's used to reflecting on their behavior, and therefore they will be more ready perhaps for the interview than someone who's never done this sort of thing before and may then need a bit more reassurance and a bit more support. So I touched on this a little in the introduction in terms of depending on how structured you want the interview to be, how different then the interview could become from a more informal conversation, or whether actually you're really wanting to keep things quite informal to help maybe get the right sort of information from the person that you're interviewing. You don't want it to be too intense. But there are a number of principles, sort of regardless of exactly how you're planning to approach the interview, and depending on what might be most appropriate in the context or in the neighborhood that you're working, in terms of how you approach the interview and how you think about the questions. And as I said on the observation video as well, I think a very important point to try and emphasize to the participants is that you're not an expert. You're coming in to learn from them. They're the experts, to give them that platform in the interview, that they're not being tested, that this isn't to judge or scrutinize their behavior. This is opening up insights based on their expertise and their competence. And that's a sort of valuable way to approach things, even for people who are not professionals in this context, that really that end user experience, that user voice, if you're conducting an interview with a user of a service or a patient in a hospital context, that their expertise is their own experience, and that's what you're interested in hearing from them. So another aspect to that is asking as open-ended questions as possible. And that's obviously easier in situations where you yourself maybe don't actually have so much expertise. If you don't know too much about the neighborhood, it's easier to ask questions that genuinely are open-ended because you don't have a preconceived idea of what the person's going to say. But obviously it's trying as much as possible as you're conducting the interview to help the person open up and not be sort of giving them a closed question that they maybe then answer yes or no to, that you're asking open questions that allow them to elaborate their experience. And it's from that obviously you yourself are going to learn more about whatever it is that you're asking them. We talked in the previous videos around user profiles in particular, but also a little in the observation videos as well, that this qualitative data gathering process, the going out and talking to users, is a chance to test your own assumptions. And obviously if you were taking a more structured approach to that, then you could be in danger of simply asking a very tight bullet-pointed list of checking out whether what you thought before you started the interview is in fact true, and does this person agree with X or agree with Y. And obviously if that's the type of analysis you want to do, then so be it. But I think that from a service design point of view, when we're interested in opening up insights into things that maybe we hadn't perceived before, or that maybe where some of our assumptions were perhaps too narrow or too informed by our own personal experience and not the experience of the service users themselves, it's very much about reframing those questions to sort of ask people whether they think that assumption is valid, and to then ask them to elaborate why they disagree with maybe what you'd assumed as an individual coming into the interview, or what you think in the project team is the problem. Asking people to reflect upon that and to sort of tell you why you're wrong. And if you're wanting to keep the interview quite structured, can be a much more focused and empowering way to get people to give you new information as part of the interview process. But in general, and particularly if you're wanting to conduct a more informal or relaxed interview, simply giving people the space to elaborate their experience and to tell you about themselves is a general principle for helping you to begin to think about how you're going to structure your interview. So the interview itself can be broken down into a number of phases, if this is helpful to support you to think about the planning of the interview. The first of those is building rapport, like we discussed on the observation video, in terms of how you create a level of trust and familiarity between yourself and the interviewee to make them feel comfortable and to help them understand what's about to happen. Then there can be a stage of introducing yourself and the project, not too much detail because you don't want to shape their perceptions too heavily, but just again so they feel comfortable. Then you've got a general stage of introductory sort of questions at a high level, followed up by a more specific stage, either based on things they've begun to tell you or based on particular areas that you're interested in understanding more specifically, particular aspects of a problem or particular aspects of a work process. And then a wrap-up phase, a chance for them to ask any questions of you or to clarify anything that's not been clear or tell you anything that they haven't already managed to in the interview. So chances are the time available to you to conduct these interviews will be limited. Not everyone has all day to sit and talk to you. So it's definitely worth thinking about how much time you want to devote to each individual part, and indeed, therefore, how many questions you're likely to be able to ask. It's not necessarily the case that you'll stick to that, depending on how the interview goes, and it's also not necessarily the case that every interview will be so time limited or time boxed, but it's just useful to sort of make sure that if there is ground you need to cover in the interview, that you have something in this interview guide in front of you that can help keep you on track or help you reprioritize the interview if it has gone really well and you've got a lot of rich insights in the first part of the interview and you suddenly realize that time's getting away from you, that you can refocus the interview midway through and make sure that you've still covered off what you need to. In terms of planning what questions to ask, there's obviously no particular right or wrong way to do this. It will depend hugely on the nature of the problem that you're exploring and who the people are that you are talking to. But one of the most valuable questions, certainly from a design research point of view, is to ask people to explain how they do certain things or how a situation is the way that it is. And that can obviously be their opinion. If it's something about, how would we improve social inclusion in this neighborhood, that's a very big question and it may be too big for some participants. Maybe you need to be more concrete in how you open that. But in principle, the most valuable question very often is to ask people how certain things are the way they are, but that it can be that you need to use some of the other question words to help open up that discussion about what happens in a specific time or at a specific place, or who the most important individuals are, before using those introductory questions to lead to how is it so that it is this way, or how could we change this, and how could it, in your opinion, could this be different? But it can also be that by structuring your initial question to ask people, for example, how did you first feel included in this neighborhood, that you can ask a how type question right at the start that allows that person to elaborate both about their own previous experience, which might contain rich insights, but also to understand, therefore, more about what it was that happened and what good practice or ideas we could take from their experience that might help us then share that experience or broaden that experience for the benefit of other people. So again, it may depend hugely on how you're planning to structure your interviews within the process of the broader neighbourhood analysis, or within the process of the project as a whole. Potentially, this first phase of interviews may well be simply gathering information about the status quo, about how things currently are. You're not maybe interested in asking people to tell you how it could be different. But generally speaking, if you start to ask people questions that are around what the problems are or what things could be improved in a neighbourhood, they will start to give you those suggestions. So it may not be possible to separate those two things out. You may be more interested in their experience to date, but chances are in them describing that experience, they're going to start telling you what could have been different, or what could have been improved, or what could have been better. So it's very much up to you as to whether you want to move in this initial interview to asking people how things could be different or how things could be improved. But it can be almost an easier conversation to start with people. What we may just need to bear in mind is that it, generally speaking, from a service design point of view, we tend to be more interested in gathering information about what are the current issues in the area before we move to the solution phase. So it might also be the case that you want to conduct two lots of interviews if you can. One initial phase that's interested in gathering people's insights into how things are the way they are and what has happened in the past that has led to the current situation, or the current layout of the neighbourhood, or the current social status of the neighbourhood. And then in a few months' time, once we summarize that data, to go back and conduct more future-oriented conversations with the same people or with different people. That will very much be up to you. And again, that distinction is something that perhaps we can discuss in the webinar on the 13th of May about what that right balance is, particularly in the corona times when actually getting hold of people and being able to have interviews with people might be a little bit more difficult. So we've talked about the how questions as a very valuable way to open up conversations with people. But there's also the why questions. And these are a little more challenging because there's a danger of the questions being a little bit more closed. In asking people why things are a certain way, you're sort of betraying that you think they are that sort of way. But also, why is a pretty powerful follow-up question. If you've asked people to explain how they first became more included in the neighbourhood, or how that happened, you can follow up with a why do you think that was the case type follow-up question, if you need people to elaborate in a little bit more detail. So again, to think in terms of how and why type questions are very, very valuable when you're beginning at this stage to think about what your interview questions are going to be, and sort of beginning to think based on your user profiles, what sort of information it's likely that different people who you interview, different types of people who you interview, what's going to be realistic for them to tell you, and how much additional prompting or additional structure around the questions they're going to need to be able to give you the information that you want. But that said, why is perhaps a question to use sparingly. It can be quite easy to fall into a trap, particularly if the person you're interviewing is a little reticent or isn't the most forthcoming, that you simply get into a pattern of constantly asking them why after every question. As doubtless many of you will be aware, there is a sort of research technique known as the 5 whys to help people sort of elaborate that if you can ask someone why 5 times, you'll really get to the heart of how they think about a topic. But obviously, as I'm sure we can all relate to, that's not necessarily also that pleasant sometimes to be put on the spot, to be asked with that much scrutiny why we feel a certain way about a certain thing and why we think what we do, particularly if it's maybe even the first time that we've ever been asked to think about this stuff or ruminate on that. So again, how and why are very important questions, very useful questions, but use them sparingly throughout the interview. Think very carefully about whether it's the best time to play the why card before you play it. So those were some sort of introductory thoughts about what questions you're going to ask. But basically, now just going to run through a sort of overview of the interview process and how you could begin to think about structuring it. And as we've said already, the first phase to the interview is really one focused on introducing yourself, explaining the background to the project, and sort of making clear what the parameters of the interview are, how long it's likely to last. And again, and I keep saying this throughout these videos, taking this opportunity to really emphasize to the participants that you're not an expert. They very much are, and that you're really looking forward to hearing their expertise and drawing on their competence. This isn't a test, this isn't some formal evaluation of their opinion or their performance in their role. That this is a chance for them to maybe feed into improving things so that the more forthcoming they can be and the more they can share with you, the better chance you have of being able to go away and help build on their opinions and their suggestions. And as we said on the observation video, building rapport, there's no sort of magic bullet, there's no easy way to do this. A lot of this comes with the experience of conducting interviews and becoming accomplished at putting people at ease when you're asking them these sorts of questions, but basically showing that you're not a threat and maybe making some small talk about the situation that you're in, the context that you're in. Again, just sort of demonstrating that you are interested, that you're not just some person coming in from outside, scrutinizing them and then going to disappear off again, but that making as much of a personal connection as you can from the outset of the interview. And then the first part of the interview proper is really just giving people a chance to introduce themselves, to open up, asking questions that are not challenging, that anyone can answer, about who they are, how they first came to work in this location, how they first came to visit this neighborhood or to occupy this neighborhood, to live in this place. Stuff that's very easy for them to explain, but that helps them become comfortable talking to you, allows you to show that you're interested in them as a person, as an individual. And then perhaps, and this will depend hugely on how you're planning to structure your investigation of the wider subject that we're interested in here, social exclusion, but maybe towards the end of this general stage, Bill asks them to start elaborating what their existing understanding of this issue is, or how they see this issue as relevant to the location or the workplace that you're actually in. And also in this stage, as they begin to elaborate on some of these factors, it's just starting to use those follow-up questions, the why questions, to sort of probe a little bit deeper. If there's anything that you begin to spot that they might have more to say on a particular topic, but they maybe don't have that level of trust or level of confidence to offer themselves straight away, basically asking questions that encourage them and help them feel more comfortable to elaborate, and to show that you're interested in those more personal opinions that they might be prepared to offer. So as I said in introducing the basic structure for an interview, after you've conducted the more general stage, it's then a case of moving to the more specific. But it might be, depending on how the conversation's going or depending on how you personally plan to structure things, that you alternate between the general and the specific. this business of asking people to elaborate in more detail can mean that you move quite quickly often to the specific phase if it's something that people are particularly knowledgeable about, or they do have a lot of detailed opinions to offer you. You might end up on the specific stage a little bit more quickly than you'd anticipated. So this ability to alternate between the general and specific and to change the focus of the interview is, again, something that comes with practice, but also comes with a little preparation about how, if it also becomes clear people aren't comfortable talking about things any longer, or maybe they suddenly get to a point where they've worried that they've said too much, that you can change tack and move back out to more general aspects of the problem, that then make them feel more at ease again, or that make it clear that this isn't an interrogation and that this inquiry, this interview, this research process is interested in the broader issues as well as the very specific ones. So as I said, this interview guide that we're beginning to think about now, about how things are going to be structured, this general stage moving to the more specific stage, or this alternation between more general questions to more specific questions, and this idea of following up with people with why questions, or trying to structure questions in terms of how, is a very sort of formal approach to planning, which I would encourage, because I think it means you turn up prepared to the interview, but obviously be prepared to deviate from it. Really, if it looks like people are prepared to offer you something that's not in the script, so to speak, but that is useful, then be prepared to follow that thread and to not worry too much, particularly if you're not intent on pursuing a very structured approach to interviewing. Be prepared to go where the participant wants to take you. And be prepared, as I've said already, to follow up, particularly around things that may give you more insights about the physical context, the physical neighborhood that you're in, and also around people's behavior, around their opinions about how things could be done differently, or things that are currently happen habitually in a neighborhood or in a workplace or in the context that you're trying to understand, the sort of patterns that happen there, and either why they think those patterns occur, but also how those patterns could be changed, or what are the key factors in those patterns that mean that they reoccur, whether those are positive or negative, or whether it's certain patterns of social behavior that mean this is a neighborhood where people end up feeling more isolated, for example, or whether this is particular workplace behaviors that mean that certain things get missed in the way that people conduct their jobs. If you feel like you're beginning to get people offering you those insights, then feel free to dig a bit deeper or to ask them those follow-up questions. And you can be, I think, quite direct. As I've said already, what we're interested in when it comes to service design and understanding contexts and people's behavior is really sequences. Asking people in the interview to tell you about a typical day in their work life, or a typical journey to the shops through a particular neighborhood. Beginning to encourage people to think sequentially and to elaborate sequentially is obviously a very innate way that a lot of people, we all tell stories. All stories have a start, a middle, and an end, however long they are. So really encouraging people to elaborate in terms of sequences, and then also in terms of quantity. So how many people do you meet on a typical day, or how many times do you meet people in a particular location, or how often does that happen? These are all great questions, how questions, but questions that are focused either on sequences of behavior or the quantity of certain events or certain interactions, or certain objects. Another approach to eliciting more information from people is to ask them to give you a specific example if they start to allude to a certain phenomena or a certain pattern or a certain sequence of behavior, and you think, wow, that sounds interesting, asking them to elaborate in more specific detail. When was the last time you dealt with a situation like that? Or what exactly happened there? That sounds really interesting. Are great ways to demonstrate that you're interested and to encourage them to share more, but also to encourage them to provide more of the detail around certain things. Some people may be reticent, they don't want to be boring, they don't want to provide lots of in-depth information straight away, but by demonstrating that you want the specifics, if it sounds like it's relevant to your research questions, then that can be a very useful way of encouraging people to say more. Related to this, again, is exceptions. When asking people, when was the last time such and such a system didn't work as planned, or when was the last time there was a problem that you encountered? Again, this is a particularly powerful one in terms of the way that our brains sort of store information or think about stories or think about things like this, is to think about the points at which things didn't work as planned or were unexpected or something unusual happened. So again, questions that focus on, can you tell me the last time that didn't work, or that something went wrong, can also be very useful for opening up further conversation about what does or doesn't work on a normal day. And finally, another sort of focal point of questions that can be useful is asking people to elaborate on the different relationships they have. Social relationships predominantly, that can always be interesting to ask people to explain. I think we're predisposed as humans to focus on social relationships, particularly in terms of how we understand situations, who the people were in that situation, or weren't in a particular situation. But also it can be people's relationships with artifacts or objects or systems that they encounter in the course of their journey to the shops or in the course of a day in their life. But again, a focal point around asking people about relationships can be a very helpful way to get more information from them. So we've talked a little bit already about being prepared to alternate between the general and the specific, and to pick up on things that people have said that sound particularly interesting, and giving them more encouragement to elaborate and to ask follow-up questions. But if you already have in your structure, or as you're planning your structure, if you already have an idea that you need to cover certain different topics, I think the key thing is to signpost those changes in tack or changes in focus quite clearly, so that people don't start to feel like maybe it was something they said that led to you needing to change the subject. I think we can all identify with situations where an abrupt change of subject can end up making us feel like it was something we said, or some awkwardness about that. So again, to try and prevent that happening, and to prevent the risk of that then undermining how the participant feels in the interview, just to be very clear that you've heard what they've just said prior to the change of tack, and that now the interview is dictating that we move on, not what it was that they said themselves. And there's another point to think about, and this is definitely a more advanced point. So for those of you who maybe are less experienced at conducting interviews, don't worry too much about this at this stage. But it is something to think about in terms of planning the interviews, is to make sure you, as the interviewer, doesn't say too much, both in terms of filling the silence, but really to give the interviewee who hasn't had the time to prepare perhaps as much as you have about what type of questions are coming or what information is expected, give them time to think and give them time to reflect. And it is an incredibly powerful technique if you can create that space and that silence, and if you have the self-confidence to just be quiet after you've asked the question and let people respond without rushing to fill the silence, or after somebody's offered one part of their answer or has answered the question, just to stay silent. It is amazing how often people will then say more and will fill that silence, and it can very often be things that are very valuable, and that if you'd been in too much of a hurry to move the interview on to the next stage or to ask some follow-up question yourself, you might have missed, or it might have come out in a different way. And related to this is also not worrying or trying to keep asking the question. I think we can all relate to the idea of when you've said something and you're a little unsure if the person's understood, so you maybe keep offering more, and before you know it, what was an open question that they maybe just needed a few seconds to reflect upon has ended up becoming a much more closed or structured question, because you've started providing, as the interviewer, have started providing more and more information to help them clarify the question. So again, it's to try and plan the questions in advance and to have confidence in them. And obviously, there will be situations where you ask something and that people can't or need further clarification. But generally speaking, people will tell you if that's the case. If they genuinely don't understand the question or they need you to put it in a different way, most people will say so, particularly if you've done a good job of creating that rapport and that trust with them at the beginning. There's also a point here about if people have misunderstood the question or have chosen to answer a different question, perhaps, as you perceive it, to the one that you asked. And there is something about being patient with that as well, using the silence there as well, because very often what people want to tell you or how they've understood your question can reveal more interesting insights, particularly if you genuinely don't have a lot of expertise or knowledge of the context in which you're interviewing people around. Maybe the things they actually want to tell you can possibly be more valuable than the original questions that you did want to ask. But again, it's about giving them the space to say what they need to say, particularly early in the interview. If people had a preconceived idea of what they were going to be asked by you, then they maybe come in wanting to say that quite early on if they've thought about it in advance and if they've prepared. And it's actually only by letting them say those things that you can then patiently and carefully later in the interview get back on to the script that you've prepared or back to the interview guide that you have prepared. So again, just a point around giving people the space to say what it is that they want to say, and not being too assertive in terms of how you correct them, or certainly not sort of saying, no, you've misunderstood or anything like that. They're the experts. You're the one coming in trying to understand their experience. So it's really just about creating an environment where they can give you that, even if that's maybe not what you'd anticipated or what you intended by the questions that you asked. So just another point here about taking notes. We mentioned before about the benefit of having multiple interviewers, having multiple people in the interview, ideally two, not too many, but one taking notes and the other asking the questions, because this can just allow the person asking the questions to focus purely on that. It's also very, very hard when somebody's replying for you to be able to take down absolutely everything they're saying. But it can be useful also for giving them space to answer if you are seen to be busy taking notes. But you potentially need to think a little bit carefully about that, because it's also a little ambitious, particularly if it's just a one-person or one-on-one interview. to imagine that you're going to be able to run the interview carefully and take note of everything they're saying. So there's obviously the option to use audio recording to record the interview, or video recording in some cases also. And like I said, with video conferences, if you're conducting the interviews over video conference, then you're getting some of that stuff for free, obviously with the participants' permission to record the interview. But it's a bit easier almost in some way to record things. But I guess you also need to be careful with your own body language as you're taking notes, to not appear to be more interested in noting certain things that the interviewee says, because it's perhaps giving away what you're most interested in, but also maintaining eye contact and showing that you're listening to the person if they're continuing to talk, whilst you're taking notes. And all of this takes a little bit of getting used to if you're not so experienced with conducting interviews. So as I say, it can be helpful to have a couple of people involved in the process. So the final phase of the interview, we've discussed that introductory rapport, a general stage of questioning, a more specific stage of questioning, and then really just giving the participants that final opportunity to tell you anything that they haven't already told you, maybe that they'd anticipated telling you but they hadn't, or stuff that's suddenly come up in their mind as a result of the questions that you're asking. Again, can be absolutely invaluable what sort of nuggets of information can come out at this sort of stage. And then a little explanation or recap about what you're planning to do with the interview data and what additional contact you will need to have or plan to have with the participants, and what the next steps are going to be, and then obviously thanking them. But there's also the aspect to think about yourself as the interviewer, or if you're a team interviewing, if there's two of you or potentially even three of you conducting the interview, it's worth just preparing, when you plan the interview, to have a little bit of time immediately after the interview, and making sure that the interviewee has left and isn't aware that you're then going to be sitting there so blatantly and talking about what you've just heard. But nonetheless, having time to reflect yourselves on what you've just heard. And the sooner you can do that, and to tidy up your notes or to finalize the note-taking process, the more information that you've just heard and is in your mind, is in your short-term memory, you'll be able to capture. And indeed, if you have a particularly structured schema about certain things you were interested in the interview, then using that time to capture those, just to make sure that you got them, or that you've captured that information, can be very, very valuable for making sure that you've got the information that you needed to from the interview. And potentially, depending on how you're planning to structure the design process in general, and how these interviews feed into the other activities that we're going to conduct as part of both the Caring Neighbourhoods approach, but also as a service design approach in general, as a more general service design principle, it can be very, very valuable as a team to sit and immediately reflect on what that user's just told you and how we would provide a solution to that. Obviously, the formal solution development phase in the service design process comes later. We're in the first phase, where we're gathering information about how things presently are in a given neighbourhood or given situation, or around a particular social problem. But it can still be a very valuable activity to go, how would we provide a solution to what that we've just heard that person say are the issues that they face in this particular neighbourhood or in this particular workplace. Just to be thinking already about how we move from listening to our users to taking a more user-centered approach to responding to their concerns, or responding to their complaints, or building on their suggestions in the interview about how things could be improved. So that concludes our video on interviewing. As with all of these service design methods, I realize there's a lot of information to sit through and listen to, or a lot of slides to read. But hopefully you will have had a chance to do so before we meet in the webinar on the 13th of May. And obviously that then is a chance for us to discuss as a project group how we plan to use these tools, or what's the best way in our local context to conduct interviews, and at which stage in the process it would be most likely, particularly with the challenges we all face in these corona times around actually being able to meet with people in a safe way, taking account of social distancing and so on and so forth, how possible it will be to conduct interviews. But please, if there's anything that's not been clear, or you have any questions or require any clarification on how to apply what we've covered in this video in your own context, then feel free to raise that in the webinar on the 13th of May. And indeed, this video, as with all the other service design tools, is intended as a starting point for discussing how you can go out and conduct a more user-centered approach in your own context to tackling the issue of social isolation and loneliness. So very much, hopefully, this has just been a provocation for yourselves to start to think about some of that in more detail. And then we can work together with each other to develop ideas around what's the best way to structure these activity, and what's the best way to gather information from our local participants to help us develop solutions to the problem of social isolation or social exclusion.